Welcome to Fontribute, where we talk about fonts and their attributes. Fontribute. It's me, Thomas, again. So this week, I noticed a couple weeks ago that Source Serif was recently released with its Italic from Adobe, and I wanted to investigate some more on the italics. So let's get started with our run through of Crimson Text and Source Serif's Italic. So these are both serif typefaces and their italic forms. So the big push we're aiming here, or our objective here, is to learn more about how italics are drawn and what major attributes we should learn about italic serif typefaces and how they're drawn. So let's move forward on this. So getting started, let's just start with kind of the basic position relationships. Generally with italics, especially the lowercase n, for example, if you notice within the bounding box relationship, there's a asymmetry in position. Notice that the type is generally sitting on the left side, or excuse me, the right side of the bounding box, with a very tight side bearing on this position, and generally extra space on the left side. So that's true generally across the board for italics. Both of these typefaces employ that method of spacing positioning. It looks pretty apparent that Crimson Text has more aggressive tightness on the right side and looseness on the left side. By the way, also in addition to the new season of Fontribute, we're basically adjusting for X height position based on the fonts. So in this case, Crimson Text had to be increased by 13% roughly to meet a rough X height position of Source Serif. So that means if you're using these fonts and you want to make a comparable review of them using the fonts, you would have to increase the Crimson Text by 13%. But we'll demonstrate that more in the text settings. All right, so looking into now the anatomy, the particulars of this. So a couple of major notes. Well, one is how the flag serif is approached, right? Obviously, Source Serif has a little more clear triangular shape in its top flag serif versus the more cursive approach in Crimson Text, like coming in and out, right? Versus across and down. And correlated with that, both of these don't have serifs on the bottom stroke on the left stem, as you can see there towards the baseline. Now, in response to this terminal direction design decision, notice where the joint is positioned. Notice how relatively low the position is in Crimson Text relative to the high position in Source Serif. So typefaces, if I would say, I think typefaces like Fournier, for example, kind of have this form where usually italics that are very cursive in feeling, they have this idea where they start from above, up and down, up and around, like so. So the branching starts relatively low on the joint, right, and transitions up, while I guess they make it more parity with, more economical with space, having your joint higher up in this position, like in Source Serif, gives it a different effect. And usually how the flag serif is drawn, this can give you some information of how the rest, like the branching of the joint, would happen and the other relationships that I've identified so far. Both of these have, if you look really closely, there's a little bit of flaring, or not flaring, but a little details on the terminal. So notice on Crimson Text there's this kind of arching bowing on the bottom over here. While Crimson Text there's a triangle, there's like a sharp point here and a flatness over here, right, on this segment right here. So note that both of these, even though there's no serifs on the bottom of their stem on the left side at the baseline territory, they're both adding a little flair, a little detail to that section, so it's not just a kind of basic form. Both of these, if you notice, both of these on the right stem, they don't have serifs, right? They have these kind of terminal strokes going in these upward motions. So take note of that. I'm trying to think of the particular. So what we would say is, it appears that Crimson Text is kind of coming out and then coming in a little bit more. There's a little more curvature in this right stem versus the more straight approach on the Source Serif stem. which I think it makes sense. There's a certain rigidity, a certain more rigidness in the source serif design decisions so far versus the more organic, smooth feelings we're seeing from Crimson Text at this time. It appears by default, because I of the increase in even with increase in scale, that it looks like Crimson Text is going to be higher in contrast, mainly because if you look at the stem weights, these are heavier than the source serif approach, while their kind of thin parts seem approximately similar. So I think net overall, especially once you adjust for type size, the font size to be equivalent or visually equivalent between the two, Crimson Text will look heavier on the page compared to source serif so far. So let's see later on if that prediction is correct or not. All right, so moving on from the N, we're going to move on to the O. So notice that usually your decision in your side-bearing positions you started with the N will be repeated and followed through in the other design. So notice in Crimson Text, again, the very aggressive O looseness on the left side bearing and the tightness on the right side bearing. And again, this is, both typefaces approach and do that, but notice that source serif doesn't do it as much, right? The degree of tightness on the right and the looseness on the left, the relationship is similar, right? It's tighter on the right than on the left, but it's not at the same degree as Crimson Text. So as we notice in position, now let's look at the shape itself. It appears that Crimson Text's O is narrower than the source serif O in its proportion, in terms of it's much more narrow, right here to here, versus here and here. It also appears that there maybe is more stress or more, notice the position of the stress relationship, right? So here's, the thin parts are, and here's the thickest parts here and here, right? Compare that to what source serif did in his approach. So besides just the wideness being variant with the two, it also looks like, it appears that it looks like the stress for the Crimson Text has the more weight pushed up here and here versus a more equivalent or a little bit more balanced distribution of weight in the source serif italic forms. Also, I think in response to that, what's happening is there's this kind of, if you notice, there's this kind of feeling like this, like kind of a shearing effect in the O in the Crimson Text, while there's a little more rectangularness, right? Even in these areas too. Not as much, like what I mean of italicizing is you should feel this sense of angledness in the O. You should feel that sense from it. But it looks like there were compensations done to kind of give a little more roundness, right, to these territories in source serif, especially compared to Crimson Text. Now, the part of this is also the width, right? The narrowness of Crimson Text justifies this more steeper slope, we'll say, right, on the outside curves of the O versus the more square approach in source serif. And especially before, when I said I had the thickness of these relate to these. In addition to that, the smallness of this counter versus the largeness of this counter gives again a prediction then that Crimson Text will look heavier in text compared to source serif so far. These are both the regular weights, by the way. So these are the regular weights. So just one more demonstration to show that just because a typeface is called regular in its weights does not mean they're equivalent, right, between one regular font and another regular font. They vary in their visual effect based on the design decisions made. All right, moving on to the D. So another basic main note of the attribution of italicizing is removal of an angle serif in this more curved form, right? Similar to the N terminal, the N stroke of the N, right, on the right stem. That continues that tradition over here. Now, that's interesting is that Crimson Serif introduces the flat serif, right, while source serif maintains its flat serif from its N source. So notice that Crimson Text seems to have more variance in the anatomy parts in there. Notice that, remember, the N at its flat serif on the N was that curved form versus the triangular form you're seeing right here. The steeper slope of Crimson Text is being continued. You can see that in the profile of the curve on the D. actually fun. No, it's actually a very fun move in source serif where there's this. It actually has a much steeper slope in this D than the O. Remember the O has a little more was like a more rectangular form. So I'm actually very curious. It's very fun to see now how the variance of the curve profiles will affect in text settings so far. That's actually kind of fun. I would have expected a more curved form like so in source serif if I were basing it from the O. So I'm excited to see how this pans out in text. They're both applying what appears to be angled stress, and that's another thing too. That even the angled stress is variant. So notice here, like here, notice how it's getting so much thicker here, almost horizontal, almost in weight right here, right, and with this area over here, versus this one also includes it. This actually seems more consistent with the O stress effect, right? Notice the additional weights here and here. These seem actually more in relation to in association with the O for Crimson text versus source serif's O to D relationship for this curve part. So very fascinating observations or differences between the two. Looking at the X height to ascender zone, it looks like Crimson text is slightly larger. It looks the ascender is taller relative to the X height compared to source serif. But we'll verify again when we get other slides on the X height position. But this is what I can see so far. Yeah, another thing to notice like this kind of entry stroke over here compared to this approach over here. So it appears that generally, there's a steeper stroke angle, secondary stroke angle in the Crimson text approach versus a flatter, kind of a shallower angle in the source serif approach so far. Okay, on to the G. So this is a fun moment because both of these approach maintaining a two-story G as opposed to a one-story, right? To give you comparison of the two, this would be a one-story G form, the one I just drew right here. So take note that they're both a two-story form, but their approach based on that are, there's actually a lot of differences. So I'll start from the upper right. Both notice the ear is different from both of these. Crimson text has a triangular form, kind of reminds you of a Garamond-esque form, like so. While source serif has this really fun form where it comes from the bowl over here, kind of extends out, and then kind of hooks up and around, like so. It's actually a really fun form. It's really unexpected. I'm curious how that's going to look in text. And look like there's a predominant weight. Notice the stress is now, we've gone to almost a vertical mode right here on the G. So the source serif looks like, what's really interesting is a lot of variance, pardon my dog, a lot of variance in the angle position of weights in the round forms. Remember the D was really almost horizontal in energy with its form. The O had some angled on it, but it wasn't too aggressive, and this one is much more vertical in relationship. So this is very fun to see all this variance in the weight distribution and the round shapes in the source serif so far already. Just let's contrast that to Crimson text. Crimson text is trying to maintain the same kind of angle in the same position. Notice this slight shearing you're feeling right here, right? That's similar to what I saw in the D and the O as an example. So it appears that Crimson text is trying to maintain its angle as much as it possibly can. Going on to now the neck, notice its position is very different. Notice the neck position is on the very almost left side of the bowl on source serif, but notice the kind of starting over on the right side for Crimson text. So notice the neck position is in completely different spots, and that creates a very different effect. Notice how dramatic this move here, and the main motion of this neck occurs roughly in this zone over here, while the slope over here is not as aggressive. It can be a slower transition, and it's maintained over on this position. So notice one of the main notes when you're drawing the italic G in the two-story form is the question of where will your neck be positioned. It will then affect where this energy mainly occurs. So versus this approach. So notice that the spine of the G in Crimson text is it's basically a steeper slope. Notice the steepness this moves versus the more horizontal approach occurring across the G in source serif. The loop basically continuing from both in response to that, they there's a more a triangular form shape over here, more exaggerating, versus a form more similar to what I expect the Roman form for the G would be for source serif between the two. One addition is where this links up. Notice this links up in this position versus this link further to the left in source serif. All right, so on to the S. So the S is a fun one, especially the crimson text. Notice the strong negative side bearing over here, but both are again playing with the same idea of variance in the left side bearing to the right side bearing. Both of these are how best to put this. Basically, again, the really consistency of the crimson text, stress angle on it. It's really trying to maintain that system. There's a kind of a push up here and around, right? And likewise over here on this side over here. Notice the smoothness of this transition, right here to here, versus it moves and then stops and then comes over, and then it kind of moves over here, then stops and comes over, and it's really to the point, very sharp to the point, right over here on the S. So, took note of, basically this how weight was distributed and moved around the stroke is very different between the two S's. All right, so I felt like it behooves me on the italic to talk about the lowercase f. I think it's a very important one to talk about. So note basically the relatively smallness of this side bearing, right? Notice its side position here and here, and the very aggressive negative side bearing positions on both of these cases. Notice very similar approaches from the S were applied over to the F, which is a fun thing about the italic. Usually they kind of pairing, which parts get paired with each other, and that may not always be the case in the Roman counterparts. I think one note in the crossbar. Notice that, again, both are rectangular in shape. Excuse me, but there's a triangulation over on this side position versus this approach, and obviously the length. This is much longer than this approach over here. So again, I'll be watching for the lowercase f to see how it renders in text going forward. All right, so now we look for a cross section of the lowercase. Let's investigate compared to the uppercase. So as we can see here, basically next to its uppercase counterparts, right? Notice source serif has an additional slight increase on the ascender versus the capi position. While this is also true for the crimson text, but not as much, right? Notice there's a more dramatic increase between the capi to ascender zone on source serif. In terms of comparing for the X height position, yeah, it would say that compared to the X height. Well, one is it is larger in crimson text versus source serif, but actually the one note I would definitely say, I noticed how narrow the capitals are in crimson text versus the source serif approach. So notice that. Let's see, I can see those are my notes I could say so far on that. All right, so our lovely checking of accent characters. So one thing we could definitely say that source serif has much larger accent characters. They're just they're proportionally much larger compared to the crimson text approach so far. Right, and notice the system for the bold terminals we saw kind of the S and the F. They're being applied pretty consistently across the entire quote marks and comma forms in the source serif. There's a more of a triangulation form in the crimson text approach. Yeah, and it's a kind of a stronger old style reference in crimson text. Like notice the strong additional weight over here versus looks like more of a transitional approach. Right in the source serif weight distribution. I almost would say it's it's almost like if I use a Norzheim model, this is like a translation versus expansion mode of contrast going on between the two. By the way, I did want to take a note to reference the numbers. I would say probably one of the weaker parts of Crimson text is it looks like these are oblique numerals, basically from the Roman, versus what appears like optically corrected. Not only the lining figures, but also old style figures are also included, as well as fractionals, numerator and denominator numbers. So Serif Serif actually has a lot of options for you given to you. This is one area I think Crimson Text could do an improvement on going forward. All right, so now with all the gravitas gone, all the introduction, now let's see what's going to happen when we set this to text. So, in general, I mean, as I increase them in type size, so there's a fun moment that occurs. I think in addition to in the way the weight is distributed, there's a kind of old style warmth you're getting from Crimson Text. Right, contrast that to this again, more either transitional or like a late transitional, almost like a Caslon-esque. I would say, actually no, it's more rigid than a Caslon. I would say Caslon's all over the place with his italic, but it's much more rational. It's like a Fournier. Actually, I think Fournier may be a good example reference point, like a good Fournier transitional Roman type that's italicized in an italic form. So, but it's more, notice the rigidity, the kind of more, I hate to say modern, but basically a kind of more a rationalist kind of rigid form this italic is taking versus this really kind of much softer, much more old, I would say, old style calligraphic referencing and the type settings so far. It is heavier, as I assumed would happen. It is a heavier weight, a color. Its color is heavier, it's darker than the source serif approach between the two. I will say, even with that said, I did feel like the spacing in the Crimson Text could use some areas of improvement. I do feel like it's the the X form, the K. There's weird issues like with the BE, for example, that feels really cramped and tight up versus the IS, where there's kind of a looseness happening. I feel like this might need another round of spacing checking just to smooth out some of the rough details of it, to be consistent with its spacing. I would take note of that. With Sword Serif, I do appreciate and I really enjoy its overall consistency of its form. And I actually do love some things like this G. It looks really successful, actually. As a form, I think it works really, really well. I definitely would say that. I do feel like at certain moments this E does feel it's dramatically wide. In fact, maybe I didn't show the E's. I wish I did a slide of it. It does feel bizarre, kind of a little wide for what it makes sense or what is reasonable to. But also while I'm here, looking at the different change of stress angles, like look at the A and the D, for example. Where I noticed the A, right? And I'm looking for the D now. Yeah, like the D and the F. It's kind of nice. I'm not sure if this was intentional or not. I remember seeing this in the brief for Source Serif's Italic, but I think actually the decision to have this variance of stress angles in the Italic was a wise move. I think otherwise this would feel very like rigid and very kind of like a wood fence, kind of like these little beams just kind of so systematically spaced apart against each other. I actually think this change of stress in the weight distribution was actually a good move to kind of give more life and kind of vitality to the form. I could definitely say that so far. I didn't comment on it before, but I did feel I will say the way the terminals and the bold terminals like in the S and the F, for example, they were, and the quotation marks, I wasn't too convinced with them large. It looked kind of bizarre. The way they felt. They didn't feel very distant, very hissy, blown up. But at these smaller settings, I'm not really minding it at all. I think actually they're quite nice. They add a nice little pop. They don't seem to bother me very much at all. So I think that's actually done very successful for text setting purposes. So like I commented before about the spacing, I really thought when you blow it up, actually really shows up. So like Axma, as you can see over here. Notice in the crimson text there's this kind of collision happening. It's almost like the X is not properly balanced to harmonize with the A and the I, for example, over here with these three. Then X, I, O over here, especially once you add the acutes and all that, it just doesn't feel very resolved in its positioning to each other. Right, compared to the source serif approach, I thought the spacing was much more consistent, harmonious, and I think reasonably appropriate. There were certain design decisions, as I saw, like the E, for example, or in this case, this X. I do feel like sometimes they were kept too wide relative to italic. That kind of throws off what they're trying to do. But overall, I think the spacing is done very well. I do think also the just capitals are just more successful in their proportion in the source serif. Right, notice how narrow this H is. Right, it's just there's something about that just doesn't feel very harmonious, and also just this weird spacing setup. Like it just the spacing arrangements are just too tight. It feels way too tight and unbalanced. Like look at that OSO, for example, right, versus this OSO. This OSO and source serif just feels more harmonious in its relationships. It just feels more comfortable. Like it feels more comfortable doing this, and this is without me doing any kind of tracking, which I normally do. So just an inside baseball thing. If you're using crimson text and you want to make this work in all caps, I definitely would track this out to make this work. I think definitely while there are spacing issues, like for example ATO, for example, in this case, I do think the overall drawings and forms of the lowercase are actually very reasonable and very good. Like I feel there's a really nice warm feeling I get from this, right? And actually that's demonstrated and contrasted to the more rigidness and that kind of stripped downness effect you're getting with source serif, which might be very good if you're using other typefaces of a similar genre. Maybe even actually this works really well probably with sans serifs because of that. Yeah, and likewise, I showed these numbers. They really demonstrate the point that this does feel like a force oblique, right? Notice the numbers just feel like they're just not harmonized for their spacing as well. Like some numbers are colliding in with each other, others too tight, others some are too loose. In a way that I feel like source serif does more appropriately, more successfully. I will repeat again, like I do feel like the way these ball terminals are handled, this very abrupt move, is a little weird in the large settings, but I do think in smaller settings it actually works surprisingly. It works really, really well, and I would encourage people to use this typeface for those purposes. All right, so with all that said, we investigated the italics and saw how they planned out, and like I said, I think while I think crimson text especially does have things it needs to work on to be the best form it could be. I think actually for a more old style kind of italic, it has a lot of warmth. And if you're looking for your layout to kind of have that kind of nice, warm, comfortable feeling of it's like a rainy day and you're having some hot cocoa under the blanket because it's getting to become fall and it's getting a little cool out. I feel like crimson text is like a pretty reasonable choice if you want to think about that. I would probably investigate the spacing, especially in larger settings. I would probably start noodling around with it to harmonize it, to be more cohesive. Source serif, I think actually what saves us from being too rigid and too almost like bleached out was this decision to have variants of the stress angles as we discovered from investigating the design. I think actually has a lot of nice character considering its very kind of transitional rigid forms or thinking about that in its renderings and its drawings. And I think the spacing I think is really overall very successful. I do think some letters are a little on the wide side for my taste and preference to be a proper italic, or at least to feel like based on the other drawings of it. But overall, I think it's very successful. And I know it's been a long wait for the italics of source serif, and I think it was well worth it. I think the kind of thinking that had to be done for this was a worthy decision. I think it's panned out very successful overall. So that was Fontribute for this week. I hope you really enjoyed it. If you want me to check out some particular fonts that come out in the market, let me know, and I could definitely be looking forward to check that out. Hope you have a great week, and talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.